It was an oddly windless evening when Lord Peter Wimsey first heard of the priest who locked the door. The phrase itself was curious enough to merit his attention, though it was spoken over tepid consommé in a dining room at Bellamy's, and delivered, of all people, by the Archdeacon of Falmouth, a man who normally confined his conversational repertoire to the comparative merits of ecclesiastical plasterwork. "The vicar at St. Thaddeus in the water," said the Archdeacon, in that half-apologetic tone clergy adopt when scandal dares invade their profession, "was found dead in his vestry last Sunday morning. The door was locked from the inside. The key was still in the lock." "Ah," said Wimsey, spoon poised. "A locked door, a priest, and a Sunday morning. Positively medieval. You may proceed, dear Archdeacon, but I warn you, I am developing a keen suspicion of symbolism." It transpired that the Reverend Simon Harrow, vicar of the small coastal parish of St. Thaddeus, had been discovered lying face down by the altar rail shortly before matins. His curate, a young man of too much zeal and too little tact, had broken down the vestry door after the church bell went unanswered. The police, represented by the well-meaning but unimaginative Inspector Binns of the local constabulary, had found the scene in perfect order. Perfect order, Wimsey reflected, was a suspicious phrase. There were no signs of struggle. None. No valuables missing, no letter of repentance. None. Only the faint scent of candle wax and something, how shall I put it, curiously sweet. The parish doctor thought it was incense. "Incense," murmured Wimsey, half to himself. Always a dangerous luxury for the soul, especially in small parishes. The Archdeacon frowned. "Really, Wimsey, you make it sound as though piety were a vice." "Sometimes it is," replied Wimsey cheerfully. "Like virtue, it depends largely on dosage." By the time the coffee arrived, Wimsey had coaxed from the reluctant Archdeacon a few more morsels. The vicar, by all accounts, had been both scholarly and peculiar, a man of fastidious habits, devoted to his choir boys, his garden, and a strange collection of antique locks. He had also, according to rumour, quarrelled recently with a parishioner over the removal of a church relic, an old oak chest said to contain the papers of a recusant priest. The local opinion, it seemed, veered between suicide and divine punishment. "Do we know," asked Wimsey lightly, "what the good Reverend locked himself in with?" "Nothing but a chalice and a candle," said the Archdeacon, crossing himself unconsciously. "But I assure you, Lord Peter, he did not kill himself. Harrow was, how shall I say, too neat a man to die untidily." That was quite enough for Wimsey. Before dessert had arrived, he had already decided to motor down to St. Thaddeus in the water. Later that evening, as he stood before his mirror adjusting a particularly whimsical bow tie, Wimsey murmured to himself, "A priest, a lock, and a key left within. 'Tis the makings of either murder or sin." Bunter, entering with the travelling case, raised a discreet eyebrow. "Shall I include the photographic plates, my lord?" "Indeed, Bunter," said Wimsey. "The countryside is full of charming doors, and, I fancy, a few rather ugly secrets waiting behind them." Outside, the wind began to rise at last, slow, deliberate, like the turning of a lock in an unseen door. The village of St. Thaddeus in the water greeted Lord Peter Wimsey with that peculiar air of watchful politeness that small English parishes reserve for strangers who arrive in motor cars. The church stood aloof on a hillock above the sea, its tower half swallowed by ivy, its bell silent and faintly green from neglect. Wimsey, alighting from his Daimler, observed the stillness with approval. It was the sort of stillness that suggested everyone was pretending not to look. Even the gulls seemed reluctant to cry too loudly. A boy on a bicycle paused to stare, was caught in the act by Bunter's implacable gaze, and promptly vanished down the lane. "Picturesque," murmured Wimsey, in a mildly necrological way. He approached the vicarage, a square Georgian house of decaying respectability, its windows curtained in a manner that implied privacy had long ago become a moral principle. The door was opened by a woman so silent that Whimsy at first mistook her for a servant. She proved to be Mrs. Harrow, the late vicar's sister and housekeeper, who spoke in a voice dry as biscuit and twice as brittle. "You'll be wanting to see the church, my lord." "They all do." She led him down a gravel path toward the vestry door, her figure small and stiff in mourning black. Whimsy, with the air of a man politely humoring local custom, allowed her to point out the spot where the door had been forced. "The police took away the lock," she said, "and broke the hinges. Simon would have hated that." Her tone contained neither grief nor warmth, only a faint, critical weariness, as though her brother's death had been an act of social inconvenience. Whimsy examined the wood. The break was clean, deliberate, and oddly high, as if the door had been barred from within with some object not immediately to hand. "Your brother had a fondness for locks, I understand." She stiffened. "He collected them, old ones, from churches and monasteries mostly. Said they had character. You'll find them all in the study." The vestry itself was immaculate, with that slightly sterile neatness of a room arranged for display rather than use. Whimsy's eyes roamed over the narrow table, the worn prayer books, the faint traces of candle smoke on the plaster. A peculiar scent lingered, sweet, metallic, faintly chemical. "Not incense," murmured Whimsy. "Something sharper." Mrs. Harrow ignored the comment. "They took his cassock," she said abruptly. "The police did, and the chalice. Said they needed to be examined." Whimsy turned toward her. "Was there anyone who disliked your brother?" She looked startled. "Disliked him? He was a clergyman, my lord." "Quite so. That's often a reason." She hesitated, then said quietly, "He had words with Mr. Pritchard, the churchwarden, about the relic chest. Simon wanted it sealed and catalogued. Mr. Pritchard said it belonged to the parish. There was talk, angry talk." They walked on to the churchyard. The grass was cut too short, as if shorn in penance. Whimsy paused by the gate, gazing toward the sea where a pale mist pressed against the headstones. "Curious," he said softly. "There's something about a locked room and a locked mind. They both invite intrusion." Mrs. Harrow did not answer. She had already turned back toward the vicarage, her spine a straight rebuke against inquiry. Bunter appeared from the lane with his usual air of omniscient decorum. "I've taken the liberty of speaking with the local constable, my lord. The deceased was found at precisely 8:45 on Sunday morning. The curate, one Mr. Denning, gave the alarm." Whimsy smiled. "Ah, the eager young curate. There's always one." He strolled toward the church porch, where a thin, pale youth stood rearranging hymnals with unnecessary precision. Denning was the sort of man who perspired virtue and expected it to be noticed. His hands trembled slightly when Whimsy introduced himself. "I came," said Whimsy gently, "to pay my respects, and perhaps to satisfy an idle curiosity. I have a mild hobby for locked doors." The curate flushed. "It was dreadful, my lord. I'd rung the bell thrice, but he didn't answer. I thought perhaps he'd been praying. Then I heard, well, nothing. Quite nothing. I fetched Mr. Pritchard and we forced the door." "Describe what you saw," said Whimsy softly. Denning's eyes unfocused, rehearsing the scene. He was lying face down. The candle was still burning, just a stump, really. There was a draught, though no window was open. I remember the chalice was on its side. There was wine on the floor. Whimsy noted the phrasing, the hesitant order of observation. And the key, still in the lock, on the inside. "Ah," said Whimsy, "then perhaps the draught was theological." The curate blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Never mind," said Whimsy. "Tell me, was your vicar in the habit of locking the vestry during prayer?" "Always. He said it prevented distraction." Whimsy smiled faintly. "An admirable principle. Unfortunately, it prevents explanations, too." When Denning departed, flustered and grateful, Wimsey lingered in the vestry alone. He crouched by the lock, tracing the grain of the new wood with gloved fingers. Something about the break troubled him. The splinters were angled inward, not outward. The door, he thought, had not been broken into, but out of. "Bunter," he said quietly, "fetch me a measure of that candle wax, if you please." "Very good, my lord." Wimsey rose, brushed dust from his knees, and surveyed the altar. On the rail lay a faint smudge, oval, reddish, like the print of a thumb rubbed against brass. "Blood?" Bunter asked. "Or wine," said Wimsey. "But note, Bunter, the pattern is upward, not downward. Someone wiped the rail from below." As they left, the church bell gave an unexpected shudder of sound, a half-struck note like a sigh. The wind off the sea had risen, rattling the windows of the nave. Wimsey paused, his face alight with mild amusement. "If I were a novelist of inferior taste," he murmured, "I should say the dead man objected to our curiosity. Fortunately, I am not." They crossed the road to the vicarage, where Mrs. Harrow stood framed in the doorway like an accusation. "You'll be wanting tea," she said tonelessly. The drawing-room smelled of dust and lavender polish. On the mantel stood a row of small, intricate locks, mounted on velvet. Wimsey examined them with real admiration. Some medieval, some Elizabethan, one Roman. "A remarkable collection," he said. "Your brother had excellent taste." "He said a man was known by the doors he trusted," she replied. "He used to spend hours fitting old keys into them, testing, oiling, polishing. Sometimes," she added abruptly, "I think he preferred them to people." Wimsey's gaze drifted to a small writing table where a half-finished letter lay beside a quill. The ink had dried mid-sentence. "Cannot permit this desecration. You do not understand." The rest was lost beneath a blot of ink, dark and deliberate. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" he asked. "His. He never sent it." Wimsey nodded. "Wise of him, perhaps. Letters are the most dangerous locks of all. They open too many doors." When he rose to leave, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The wind carried the smell of salt and damp stone. Wimsey stood by the car, gazing back at the church tower, its weathercock motionless against the dimming sky. "A priest who loved locks," he said softly. "A door locked from within. A sister who measures her words in ounces. A curate who rings too early, and a churchwarden with a temper. Bunter, I believe we have the beginnings of something deliciously illogical." "Indeed, my lord," said Bunter gravely. "Shall I make inquiries about Mr. Pritchard?" "Do so. And ask, if you please, whether he keeps his conscience as well-oiled as his accounts." Wimsey smiled faintly, climbing into the Daimler. "For in my experience, Bunter, when a man of God locks a door, it is not heaven he's trying to keep out, but himself. Mr. Abel Pritchard, churchwarden of St. Thaddeus in the Water, was a large man of that florid, self-satisfied breed which believes moral rectitude can be measured in girth. When Lord Peter Wimsey called upon him the following morning, Pritchard received his visitor in an over-furnished drawing-room smelling faintly of port and disinfectant. "Sad business, my lord, very sad," he began, polishing his spectacles with an air of proprietary grief. Reverend Harrow was a difficult man, of course, stubborn, peculiar notions about church property, but a clergyman to the core. I dare say the good Lord will sort it all out now. Wimsey, perched delicately on the edge of a horsehair armchair, smiled with polite skepticism. "Indeed, Mr. Pritchard, though experience suggests the Almighty prefers to delegate such sorting to the coroner's jury." The remark seemed to land uneasily. Pritchard coughed, rearranged his waistcoat, and began to enumerate the vicar's eccentricities, his nasty habit of burning candles at uncanonical hours, his mystical leanings, and his foolish attachment to that relic chest, which, as Pritchard reminded him with patriotic indignation, was parish property by every lawful precedent. Whimsy listened with apparent idleness, his long fingers tracing the embroidery of the chair arm. "Tell me," he said suddenly, "how came you to quarrel over a box?" Pritchard blinked. "Not quarrel, my lord, merely a difference of opinion. The chest is 17th century, oak, worm-eaten, locked for as long as anyone remembers. The vicar wanted to send it to the diocesan museum, said it contained recusant papers of no moral use. I said nonsense. An empty chest can be as valuable as a full one if it's historical. He took it ill." "You mean," said Whimsy mildly, "he thought you preferred your relics empty." The churchwarden flushed. "I'll not have it said I showed disrespect to his office." "Heaven forbid," murmured Whimsy. "Though I wonder, Mr. Pritchard, was the chest locked?" "Naturally. There's no key." "And did Reverend Harrow have one made?" "He wouldn't say. I believe he tried. Spent evenings in that study of his fiddling with old keys like a watchmaker. Foolish hobby, locks. Nothing good ever came of a man who shuts himself in." Bunter, hovering discreetly by the window, took note of a curious item on the mantel, a small brass key, recently polished, its teeth oddly filed. Whimsy, following his glance, said with airy indifference, "A charming trinket. Souvenir, perhaps." "Found it in the churchyard," Pritchard said quickly. "Weeks ago, probably one of the vicar's old bits of rubbish." "Rubbish," echoed Whimsy softly. "Ah, yes, the archaeologist's curse. We never know what to throw away." He rose, thanked his host, and departed, leaving Pritchard perspiring faintly among his overzealous antimacassars. Outside, the morning had turned sharp and blue, the sea glimmering like glass behind the church tower. "Bunter," said Whimsy, lighting a cigarette. "The late Reverend Harrow was not merely a collector of locks. He was an artist in concealment. Pritchard, on the other hand, is a man who mistakes noise for innocence. Between the two, we may find an answer." "Indeed, my lord," said Bunter. "I took the liberty of observing a faint abrasion on that brass key, consistent with recent filing." "Excellent," murmured Whimsy. "A filed key, a locked chest, and a priest who died behind his own door. We are in the presence, Bunter, of someone who very much enjoys the symbolic." They returned to the church, where the curate Denning was rehearsing the choir boys in a hymn of uncomfortable cheerfulness. The sound jarred against the silence of the nave. Whimsy motioned to the vestry. Inside, the faint scent of that sweet chemical lingered still. He knelt by the altar rail and scraped a minute trace of residue into a small envelope. "Smells faintly of ether," he murmured. "Or possibly chloroform. What say you, Bunter?" "Something volatile, my lord. I fancy the vicar's candle wasn't the only thing burning." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "Quite. If our reverend gentleman was rendered unconscious before he fell, then the locked door becomes less a mystery than a message. The question is, to whom was it addressed?" They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Mrs. Harrow entered, pale and severe, carrying a small parcel. "This came for Simon 2 days before his death," she said quietly. "The postmistress brought it to me this morning, thinking perhaps you'd wish to see it." Whimsy accepted the parcel. The paper was foreign, Belgian by the look, and the handwriting fine, angular, scholarly. Inside lay a folded letter and a small iron key, oddly ornate, black with age. The letter, written in Latin, began with a phrase that made Whimsy's eyebrows arch. "Clavis peccati est in corde tuo." "The key of sin is in thy heart," he translated softly. Mrs. Harrow shuddered. "He never mentioned it. I found it unopened in his drawer." "And the handwriting?" "I don't know it. He studied abroad once, in Louvain, long ago. He spoke of an old friend, Father Corbet." "Indeed," said Whimsy. "A name with an ecclesiastical flavour and possibly a secular purpose. I shall inquire." As she withdrew, Bunter observed, "A curious coincidence, my lord. An ancient key arriving by post just before a death involving locks." Coincidence, Bunter, said Whimsy, is merely providence in amateur disguise. Still, it's worth noting. Tell me, did you notice Mrs. Harrow's hands? Yes, my lord. Reddened, as from recent cleaning with carbolic. Precisely. A woman who scrubs floors when her brother's corpse is barely cold is either very innocent or very nervous. Let us reserve judgment until tea time. They called next at the village shop, a cramped emporium presided over by Miss Hilda Grey, who possessed both the curiosity and conscience of a parish gazette. Dreadful affair, my lord, she said, lowering her voice with relish. The vicar was a strange one. Never took sugar, never smiled, but proper, you understand. Too proper. And that sister of his, always peering about after dark. She was seen near the church on Saturday night, they say. Whimsy leaned forward. Indeed. At what hour? After 9. Maybe later. Mr. Pritchard saw her himself from his window. Said she had something in her hands, a box, perhaps. Whimsy thanked her gravely and bought a packet of cough drops to reward her civility. Outside he drew a slow breath. Bunter, if Pritchard saw her, then he was watching. Men who watch are seldom innocent. That evening, Whimsy returned to the church alone. The wind had dropped again. The sea whispered faintly beyond the lich gate. He carried with him the iron key from the parcel. The lock of the relic chest resisted him only briefly, before yielding with a soft, reluctant sigh. Inside lay a collection of brittle papers, bound with twine, and a small vial half filled with dark residue. A faint sweetness rose at once, the same scent from the vestry. Whimsy held the vial to the light. "Chloroform tincture," he murmured. "How very unclerical." Beneath the papers lay a folded document in English, clearly more recent. It was a will, Reverend Harrow's, dated 3 days before his death. The beneficiary was his sister, the witness Abel Pritchard. Whimsy's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed. "Convenient," he whispered. "Too convenient by half." He replaced the items carefully and relocked the chest. As he turned to leave, a faint sound stirred the air, a creak, then a shadow shifting behind the chancel screen. "Good evening," said Whimsy calmly. The curate emerged, pale and shaking. "My lord, I thought I heard someone." "So you did," said Whimsy. "Your hearing does you credit. Tell me, Mr. Denning, why was the vestry candle still burning when you found the body?" I don't know. Perhaps he left it." "Or perhaps," said Whimsy softly, "someone relit it, to make us think he had been alive longer than he was. That would account for the confusion in the time of death. You rang the bell at 8, I believe." "Yes." "Then he must have died before 7. Yet Mrs. Harrow says she heard his step in the hall at 1:30. Curious, is it not, how dead men keep appointments they cannot attend?" The curate's mouth trembled. "You think she—" "I think nothing, Mr. Denning. I merely observe. But observation, like confession, tends to be inconvenient." Whimsy left him standing in the candle's wan light, a pale figure trembling between faith and fear. Outside, Bunter waited with the car. "Find anything, my lord?" "Only what we expected, a key, a bottle, and a will. Enough to lock the case, or unlock it, depending on our courtesy to the truth." He gazed back at the dark tower. "The dead vicar has spoken, Bunter, though only in Latin. The key of sin, he says, lies in the heart. The difficulty, of course, is discovering in whose chest it fits." The next morning dawned grey and still, the kind of dull English light that seems specially designed for inquiry. Flat, revealing, merciless. Lord Peter Whimsy stood by the window of the vicarage study, gazing out toward the sea while Bunter methodically arranged the late Reverend Harrow's correspondence on the desk. "I've always admired," Whimsy murmured, "how death simplifies a man's social circle. One finds that the dead, unlike the living, keep only significant letters. He gestured to the small stack. Any gossip? Bunter adjusted his spectacles. 3 bills, 2 parish circulars, 1 letter from a publisher rejecting a theological essay, and 1 from Father Corbett, dated last month. Wimsey turned, intrigued. Ah, the Belgian correspondent. Read it, Bunter, but with your usual discretion. Omit anything that might improve my morals. Bunter cleared his throat and began. My dear Simon, you were right to be cautious. The relics of such a house are best forgotten. The lock you showed me in your last drawing may belong to the old recusant cell under the nave. If you value peace, do not open what was sealed by conscience. Signed, Auguste Courbet, S.J. Wimsey whistled softly. Well, well. A priest warns a priest against opening a lock, a biblical motif if ever there was one. He took the letter and examined the signature. Latin hand, precise, almost academic. Courbet may be our ghost without a sheet. He spent the next hour inspecting the vicar's collection of locks, which hung in neat rows upon the study wall. The variety was astonishing. Iron bolts from Tudor monasteries, intricate Gothic padlocks, even a Venetian gate latch shaped like a lion's face. Observe, Bunter, the irony, Wimsey said. A man fascinated by locks dies because of one. It's almost poetical if one's morals are sufficiently disordered. Bunter, kneeling to photograph the chest, replied, The symmetry is undeniable, my lord, though I fancy the mechanism is not merely metaphorical. Wimsey chuckled. No, indeed. Our murderer is probably as literal-minded as a solicitor. Which reminds me, we must verify that will. Kindly ring up the solicitor's office in Winton. Bunter obeyed. After a brief exchange with the clerk, he reported, The will was deposited there 2 days before the vicar's death, my lord. The sister delivered it herself. The clerk remembers her hands were gloved, and her manner, he says, businesslike. Wimsey nodded slowly. So she ensured her brother's wishes were safely filed, before his unfortunate demise. Considerate woman, yet I wonder why she failed to mention that. Later that morning, Inspector Binns called at the vicarage, all bustling authority and provincial confidence. He found Wimsey leaning against the mantel with infuriating calm. Good day, my lord. I hear you've been poking about a bit. Don't see as there's much mystery, though. Parson had a turn of the head, locked himself in, lit his candle, and took too much of that foreign sleeping stuff. Bottle of the stuff found in his drawer. Doctor says it could have stopped his heart easy. Indeed, said Wimsey, but I rather fancy chloroform fumes don't leave the lock turned the wrong way, Inspector, nor do they compose new wills on the eve of collapse. Binns bristled. You've got theories, I suppose. Only questions, said Wimsey amiably. For instance, how long would it take for a man to lose consciousness if someone held a chloroform-soaked cloth near him while he prayed? That's nasty talk, the inspector muttered. He was a clergyman. Quite so, said Wimsey, but clergymen die much like other sinners. Thank you, Inspector. Your competence relieves me of the painful duty of believing in miracles. When the door closed, Bunter ventured, A dangerous line, my lord. The inspector won't enjoy being thought respectable. Wimsey smiled. No man does, Bunter. It suggests limitations. He sat down at the desk and began rearranging the vicar's pocket diary, which had been returned by the police. The entries were sparse. Services, meetings, a cryptic note. Saturday, chest again, P interfering, must finish key. Then, on Sunday, the day of his death, a single word. Locked. Wimsey stared at it for a long moment. Bunter, if you wished to record despair, would you write only that? No, my lord. I should add something melodramatic. Precisely. Which is why I believe it was a clue, not a confession. He tapped the word with one long finger. Locked, past tense. Something or someone was completed. Secured, enclosed. Not himself. someone else. In the afternoon, Whimsy walked down to the shore. The sea was iron-grey and listless. Children were collecting shells among the rocks, while two fishermen smoked by a boat that looked older than theology. One of them, when asked, admitted he had seen a light in the church window late on Saturday night. "Thought 'twere the vicar praying again," he said. He often did, candle burning past midnight sometimes. Whimsy thanked him and looked up toward the hill. The church tower loomed dark against the sky, its windows dull. A light burning past midnight, too early for matins, too late for innocence. Returning by the lane, he met Mrs. Harrow carrying a basket of groceries. She seemed startled to see him and dropped a tin of cocoa. "Forgive me," said Whimsy, picking it up. "I fear I have an unfortunate habit of materializing in the wrong places." She forced a smile. "I was just buying things for the curate. He's not well. The shock, you understand." "Quite," said Whimsy gently. "A good many people seem unwell in St. Thaddeus. Grief, perhaps, or guilt. I never can distinguish them from the outside." Her eyes flashed. "You've no right to make insinuations." "None whatever," he agreed cheerfully. "That is why I make them. It's so much safer than accusing." She turned sharply and walked on. Whimsy watched her go, noting the stiffness of her gait. "A proud woman, Bunter," he murmured. "She walks like one carrying an invisible burden and trying not to drop it." That evening he wrote a brief letter to Father Corbett in Belgium, enclosing a photograph of the Iron Key. "My dear Father," he wrote, "if friendship and curiosity may excuse intrusion, I should be grateful for any information concerning the origin of the lock described in your letter to Reverend Harrow. It may assist in preventing further theological confusion in this parish." He smiled as he sealed it. "An honest Jesuit," he mused, "might tell me more than an honest policeman." By candlelight, Whimsy and Bunter re-examined the relic chest. "Note the hinges," Whimsy said. "Recently oiled, and the dust pattern on the lid. Disturbed at the edges only. Someone opened it after the vicar's death." "Mrs. Harrow, perhaps?" Bunter suggested. "She dusts compulsively." "Ah, but dusting leaves a wider smear. This is the careful lifting of an object, probably papers. She may have retrieved or replaced something." He lifted the lid again, careful to disturb nothing. Inside, the twine around the bundle of papers had been re-knotted. The knot was peculiar, double-looped, reversed underhand. "An unusual knot, Bunter. The sort sailors use, or scouts. Did you notice any knots in the curate's surplice cords?" "Yes, my lord. Tied exactly the same way." Whimsy leaned back, eyes alight. "Now that is delicious. Our sanctimonious curate, it seems, is more practical than he appears." The next day brought a letter from Winton. The coroner's report confirmed death by cardiac arrest, possibly induced by shock or inhalation of chloroform. Time of death estimated between 6:30 and 7. Whimsy read it twice. "So," he said quietly, "by the time the curate rang the bell, his vicar was already cold. Yet the candle was freshly lit. The only person near enough and pious enough to relight it would be the curate himself. Unless—" He stopped, smiling faintly. "Unless someone wished us to think so." After supper, as mist rolled inland from the sea, Whimsy walked once more to the church. The great door stood half open, the lock newly mended. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of polish and damp stone. He crossed to the vestry, struck a match, and watched the flame dance along the brass candlestick. In its light, he saw faint fingerprints on the glass window above the door, too high for Mrs. Harrow, too careless for Bunter. He placed his hand against them. They matched his own height. "So our intruder was no giant," he murmured, "but determined." He turned the handle. It moved, freely now, silent as thought. Locked rooms, Bunter, are like lies. They only work while no one tries them. Outside, the church bell gave a single, hollow note. Whimsy smiled into the darkness. The stage is nearly set. Tomorrow we shall invite our cast to a little rehearsal. The truth, I think, will enjoy being overheard." The following afternoon found Lord Peter Wimsey presiding over what he referred to, with characteristic mischief, as a small social experiment. The scene was the vicarage drawing-room, its curtains half drawn against the lowering sky, its atmosphere heavy with the polite tension of forced civility. Seated in uneasy alliance were Mrs. Harrow, pale and composed, Mr. Pritchard, red-faced and defensive, and the curate, Denning, whose every movement betrayed the nervous agitation of a man who fears truth as much as guilt. Inspector Binns occupied a corner, his notebook bristling with suspicion, but his imagination dormant. Wimsey stood by the mantelpiece, hands clasped lightly behind his back, his expression one of pleasant detachment, as if the occasion were merely a parlour game. "My dear friends," he began, "I crave your patience for a trifling reconstruction. You see, certain details of the late Reverend Harrow's unfortunate demise have proved, shall we say, recalcitrant. The police, with their habitual devotion to simplicity, have suggested a most unflattering hypothesis: suicide by chloroform. Yet the facts, alas, refuse to conform. I therefore propose a modest exercise in applied logic." Mrs. Harrow's hands tightened on her lap. "If this is to be some sort of performance, Lord Peter, I beg to be excused. My brother's death is no entertainment." "Nor is it," said Wimsey gently, "though the Almighty's stage management often borders on the theatrical. Still, I assure you, madam, the performance is not mine, but another's. I merely supply the curtain." He turned to Denning. "Mr. Denning, you discovered the body, I believe?" Yes, my lord." "Excellent. You found the door locked, the key inside, the candle burning, the body face down. Tell me, was the key turned fully?" I think so." "Ah, but you are uncertain. Naturally, shock blurs precision. Permit me to remind you that the door was later found to have been forced inward, yet the splinters indicated pressure from within. In short, the lock resisted escape, not entry. Curious, is it not?" Denning blinked rapidly, lips parted as if to speak, then thought better of it. Wimsey continued in the same conversational tone. "The vicar, then, must have locked himself in, or appeared to. The distinction is crucial, for we must ask, who benefited from his enclosure?" Pritchard shifted uneasily. "If you mean to suggest—" "My dear Mr. Pritchard," said Wimsey, "I never suggest. I only invite others to incriminate themselves through the power of rhetoric. But since you interrupt, let us discuss your testimony. You claim to have seen Mrs. Harrow outside the church on Saturday night carrying a box." Pritchard's ruddy complexion deepened to a dangerous crimson. "Aye, I did. I know what I saw." "Indeed. And yet you failed to mention that the box in question, the relic chest, was still in the vestry when the police arrived, untouched. Might your memory, like your conscience, be a trifle selective?" The churchwarden sputtered. "I saw her, I tell you." "Undoubtedly," said Wimsey, "for she was bringing her brother's supper from the vicarage, not ancient relics. Mrs. Harrow, will you confirm?" The woman's gaze remained steady. "Yes, he refused to eat in company that night. He often worked late." "So she carried a tray," said Wimsey smoothly. "Not a chest. Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. Your eyesight has done its duty to gossip, if not to fact." A faint ripple of tension moved through the room. The inspector cleared his throat. "If you've something solid, my lord, I'd appreciate it in plain English." "Very good," said Wimsey. "Plain English it shall be. The Reverend Harrow was killed by someone who wished his death to resemble a pious accident. The murderer locked the door from the inside after the fact. That is, the lock was turned by means of a string or wire passed through the keyhole. When the police found it, the key was left in place to complete the illusion." Binns frowned. "Then where's your proof?" Wimsey smiled faintly. "You will find a length of thin copper wire beneath the vestry table. I took the liberty of retrieving it this morning." He drew it from his pocket and laid it on the mantelpiece, gleaming faintly in the dim light. A curious relic indeed, and attached to one end, see here, a smudge of wax from the same candle found near the body. Wax which, when examined, contains traces of chloroform. A low murmur passed through the group. Denning's face had gone deathly white. "That proves nothing," he whispered. "On the contrary," said Wimsey, "it proves a good deal. It proves, for instance, that someone held a chloroform-soaked cloth near the vicar's face while pretending to light the candle. The fumes would have rendered him unconscious within seconds. Then, using this wire, our ingenious culprit locked the door and escaped through the window above the vestry, small but sufficient for a slender figure." His gaze drifted almost lazily toward the curate. "You are a slender figure, Mr. Denning." No, it wasn't." "Please," said Wimsey softly, "let us not spoil the symmetry. The knot used to retie the papers in the relic chest matches precisely the one used to fasten the choir surplice cords. You tied it, Denning, when you removed the papers your vicar meant to expose, those concerning your theft of parish funds for your mother's treatment in London. A forgivable sin, perhaps, but one he could not ignore. You went to plead, found him obdurate, lost your nerve, and, well, men have killed for less divine causes." Denning's breath came in short, broken gasps. "You can't prove it," he stammered. "The wire. Anyone could—" "Ah, yes," said Wimsey, "but only one person knew the mechanism of that ancient lock. Your vicar taught you himself. Remember, a key is only as honest as the hand that turns it. His words, not mine." The curate clutched the arms of his chair, eyes fixed on the carpet. "He said he'd tell the archdeacon," he muttered. "He said I wasn't fit for holy orders. I begged him, God knows I begged him, but he called it theft." "And so you silenced him," said Wimsey quietly. "You left the candle burning, locked the door, and returned to your lodgings to ring the bell at dawn, hoping the appearance of piety would absolve you. But guilt, my dear fellow, is an uncooperative parishioner. It confesses when least convenient." There was a long silence. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes with soft persistence. Mrs. Harrow rose suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Is it true, Mr. Denning?" He buried his face in his hands. "I didn't mean to. He fell, he struggled. I only meant to frighten him." Pritchard muttered a curse and turned away. Inspector Binns, visibly shaken, stepped forward, producing handcuffs with fumbling gravity. "I'll have to take you in, sir," he said awkwardly. Wimsey inclined his head. "Gently, Inspector. The Church has already punished him more effectively than the Crown ever could." As the curate was led out, his figure bent and broken, Mrs. Harrow sank into her chair, face pale but composed. "You have your murderer, Lord Peter," she said bitterly. "Are you satisfied?" Wimsey looked at her with curious compassion. "Satisfaction, madam, is a vulgar emotion. I am merely relieved that your brother's devotion to locks has found so moral an echo. He shut his sins away. His curate merely imitated the habit." When the room had emptied, Wimsey remained before the fire, gazing into the embers. Bunter entered softly. "Shall I pack, my lord?" "Presently," said Wimsey. "I find myself reflecting, Bunter, that confession is the only true key, though one usually forges it too late. Poor devil. He killed out of fear, not malice. Most men do, my lord." "Quite so," Wimsey sighed. "I dare say St. Thaddeus will have sermons enough to last the decade. Still, I wonder if the vicar understood the irony. Dying behind the very door he so loved. Poetic justice, perhaps, though I mistrust any poetry arranged by Providence." He straightened his cuffs, glanced once around the melancholy room, and reached for his hat. "Come, Bunter, the sea air here is entirely too moral. Let us return to London, where sin at least dresses for dinner." Outside, the church bell struck 7, the same hour the vicar had died. and the sound lingered in the mist like a benediction withheld. Whimsy paused, listening, and murmured half to himself, "A pity, really." He locked himself away from the world, and the world obliged him by following. Then, with a faint smile that was neither cynical nor kind, he stepped into the gathering dusk. The inquest at St. Thaddeus took place 3 days later under the greyest sky in Christendom, as if heaven itself had donned mourning for the sake of convention. The village hall, which smelled of damp hymnals and boiled cabbage, was filled to the rafters with spectators pretending to lament the scandal they secretly adored. Lord Peter Wimsey attended not from necessity, his work was done, but from a fastidious sense of completion. "It is the moral equivalent," he murmured to Bunter, "of staying for the last act of a play one already knows the ending to. Courtesy to the author, you understand." Bunter, expression immaculate, murmured assent and adjusted the collar of his master's coat. At the front, the coroner, a pink-faced man of unimaginative integrity, cleared his throat and began the proceedings. The curate Denning sat between 2 constables, pale and subdued, a figure of tragic ordinariness. Mrs. Harrow occupied a corner seat, gloved hands clasped, eyes fixed on nothing. Mr. Pritchard, puffed with righteousness, whispered audibly that justice would be done. Whimsy smiled faintly and made no bets on that point. The evidence unfolded with the dreary inevitability of English law. Inspector Binns gave his account in tones of solemn triumph, producing the copper wire and the residue-stained wax with an air of proprietary achievement. The crowd murmured approval, pleased that guilt had acquired tangible form. The chemist from Winton testified that the wax contained chloroform traces. The coroner nodded sagely, as though this chemical fact vindicated the moral order of the universe. When Denning was asked to stand, a shiver of sympathy, half genuine, half theatrical, ran through the room. His confession, such as it was, had already been whispered through every thatched roof in the parish. Still, the ritual of repetition had to be observed. He spoke softly, almost reverently. "I went to see him that night. I begged him not to expose me. He said I had broken my vows of honesty, that I must resign or face disgrace. I lost my head. He turned away to pray, and I pressed the cloth to his face. When he stopped struggling, I thought he was only faint. Then I saw he wasn't breathing." His voice cracked. "I locked the door because I couldn't bear them to find him that way. I lit the candles so it would look peaceful." There was a collective exhalation, the kind that follows the expected line in a sermon. The coroner sighed and announced that the jury might retire, though they did not trouble to leave the room. "Manslaughter," someone whispered. "Mercy killing," muttered another, and within minutes the verdict was returned. Death by misadventure caused by reckless handling of a narcotic substance. It was, Whimsy thought, the sort of verdict England excelled at, tidy, humane, and entirely untrue. The curate was remanded for sentencing, but the law, having labelled him sufficiently, seemed content to forget him. Mrs. Harrow did not move during the verdict, only bowed her head briefly, like one acknowledging an expected blow. Outside, the wind had risen again, sending small eddies of dust along the churchyard path. Whimsy lingered at the gate, watching as Denning was led away between his guards. "A curious specimen of morality, Bunter," he said quietly. "He murdered for the sake of remaining respectable. A pious inversion, if ever there was one." Bunter, who disliked theological analysis, confined himself to observing that the press would likely make much of the story. "No doubt," said Whimsy, "they will call it the tragedy of the locked vestry and moralize about temptation in lonely parishes. I might almost pity them. Reality is so rarely printable." He called later that evening at the vicarage to take his leave of Mrs. Harrow. She received him in the same neat drawing-room, the same odour of lavender and repression clinging to the air. "You've had your truth, Lord Peter. she said before he could speak. "Does it satisfy you?" "Truth, madam," he said, "is like confession. It relieves the conscience, but seldom the heart." She regarded him coldly. "You think my brother would have forgiven him?" "I think," said Wimsey slowly, "that your brother believed more in punishment than in grace. Perhaps that is why his locks pleased him. They obeyed him without forgiveness." She gave a small, sharp laugh. "You speak as though he deserved to die." "No," he said softly, "but he invited tragedy as one invites music, by perfecting the instrument for it." She turned away, hands trembling. "You don't understand. He was my life. I scrubbed his floors, cooked his meals, endured his silences. And for what? So he could die by the hands of that weak, simpering boy." Wimsey's voice was gentle. "You resent him less for killing your brother than for surviving him. It's a very human arrangement." He left her standing by the hearth, her figure stiff and small against the dying firelight. Outside, the twilight had deepened to blue-gray, the first stars faint over the sea. The church bell rang once, slow and deliberate, as if reluctant to disturb the air. "Bunter," he said as they reached the car, "one might almost believe the bell tolls for self-satisfaction. There's a lesson there, though heaven forbid anyone should learn it." The following morning, as Wimsey prepared to depart for London, the post arrived with a foreign letter. He broke the seal absently, then smiled with genuine pleasure. "From our Jesuit friend, Father Corbett. Listen, Bunter. The lock you describe was indeed from a recusant chamber built to conceal priests during the persecutions. It could be secured only from within by a system of counterweights and wire. A man hiding there could lock himself away entirely from the world, though the mechanism allowed, by a certain manipulation, for one outside to simulate such closure. If Reverend Harrow sought to master this device, I fear he tempted Providence. Some doors, my dear Lord Peter, are better left unopened." Wimsey folded the letter thoughtfully. "Providence, Bunter, has an ironic turn of phrase. It seems our vicar died by the very trick he studied." "Fitting, my lord," said Bunter. "A cautionary parable, one might say." "Quite," said Wimsey. "Only the moral is wasted on the living. We all prefer the comfort of a locked door to the draught of truth." They drove toward the station through lanes glistening with last night's rain. The sea was invisible now, but its scent clung to the wind like a memory of unrest. Wimsey leaned back, humming a fragment of Bach, his mood one of melancholy amusement. "It's odd, Bunter, how murder always ends not with horror but with quiet. The living tidy up, the dead are tidied away, and the world resumes its well-bred composure. One could almost believe civilization itself were an alibi." "Indeed, my lord," said Bunter gravely, "and an effective one." At Winton Station, a newspaper boy was shouting the headline, "Priest's Death Solved. Curate Confesses." Wimsey bought a copy, glanced at it, and handed it to Bunter. "Observe, Bunter, how concision improves morality. A dozen complexities reduced to 3 words and a headline. Journalism is the modern equivalent of divine judgment, swift, inaccurate, and final." He gazed out at the departing landscape as the train gathered speed, the fields stretching flat and pale beneath the sky. "Still," he added softly, "there's a peculiar comfort in completion. Even the untidiest conscience likes to be told the story is finished." Bunter, folding the newspaper with immaculate precision, ventured, "You believe it truly finished, my lord?" Wimsey considered. "As finished as any human story, which is to say, until the next chapter insists upon itself. Somewhere, perhaps, another door is being locked, another conscience mislaid. The pattern repeats itself with admirable punctuality." He smiled faintly, his eyes on the horizon. "After all, Bunter, the universe is merely an elaborate crime, carefully planned, perfectly executed, and destined, sooner or later, to be found out." The train clattered onward, carrying him back toward London, toward brandy, cigars, and the company of people whose sins were conducted with style. Yet as the countryside slipped past, Whimsy found his thoughts returning, uninvited, to the quiet church above the sea and the locked vestry where a devout man had sought to contain sin with iron, and died learning it could not be confined. He thought of Mrs. Harrow, scrubbing at the stain on the rail that would never come out, of Denning in his cell whispering prayers to a God he no longer trusted, and of the wind moving through the tower like breath through an empty lung. "Strange," he murmured, almost to himself. "The dead seldom trouble me, but this one keeps the key." Bunter glanced up. "Did you speak, my lord?" "Only to the scenery," said Whimsy lightly. "It listens better than most theologians." The train whistled once, and the sound stretched thin across the plain, like a final echo fading into silence. London, in its late autumn mood, received Lord Peter Whimsy with the air of a tired hostess obliged to smile at an old guest. The fog hung low and yellow over Piccadilly, and the lamps glowed like relics from a dimly remembered age of certainty. Whimsy, seated in his club chair at Bellamy's, regarded the fire with mild disfavor, as though it too might conceal some moral deficiency. He had been home a week, but the affair of St. Thaddeus refused to lie down like a well-behaved corpse. It haunted him with a kind of austere persistence, not as tragedy, for he had long made his peace with human folly, but as an unresolved chord. The case had ended with neatness, yet not with harmony, and to Whimsy, untidiness of tone was more intolerable than untidiness of fact. "A priest, a lock and a wire," he murmured. "All so exquisitely arranged, yet one feels the conclusion lacks rhythm." Across the room, a member rustled his newspaper and coughed, as if to disapprove of metaphysics before luncheon. Bunter entered discreetly, carrying a tray of correspondence. "Post, my lord. 2 invitations, a bill from the wine merchant, and a letter bearing the Belgian stamp again." Whimsy brightened. "Ah, our Jesuit of the locked conscience returns. Let us see what divine mischief he has written now." He slit the envelope with a silver knife and unfolded the letter. "My dear Lord Peter," he read aloud, "I have made further inquiries regarding your unfortunate English vicar. It seems he corresponded with one of our scholars here concerning a treatise on penance and secrecy. He believed, poor soul, that sin might be purified through ritual isolation. I fear he took the doctrine too literally. You may also wish to know that a similar lock was once employed by a priest who disappeared in 1620. When the chamber was opened years later, it was found sealed from within. There are doors, my friend, which close both ways." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Deliciously macabre, Bunter. The church does irony better than the theatre." He folded the letter. "Still, there's comfort in universality. Even the devout repeat their follies with historical accuracy." He dined that evening with Charles Parker, now Chief Inspector, who listened with tolerant amusement as Whimsy outlined the case over a bottle of Burgundy. "You always find something mystical in these things," Parker said. "To me it's simple. A frightened man kills another and then loses his head." "Of course it's simple," said Whimsy. "That's the tragedy. Simplicity is the ultimate horror. It leaves no room for elegance. One can almost forgive murder if it's executed with imagination. But this was clumsy salvation." Parker laughed. "You should have been a theologian." "I tried," said Whimsy lightly, "but the hours were irregular." After Parker left, Whimsy walked home through the fog. The lamps swam before him like uncertain planets. In the haze, his own footsteps seemed detached, as though some other man walked just behind him, echoing each movement half a second late. He paused once beneath a gaslight, struck by the thought that London itself was a great locked room, millions of souls sealed behind their own iron doors, each pretending privacy were virtue. "We are all curates of our own guilt," he murmured. and we all light candles for show." He smiled at his own morbidity and quickened his pace. Back at his flat, the gramophone was playing faintly. Bach's Art of Fugue, that grave architecture of sound which seemed to build cathedrals in the air. "Leave it, Bunter," he said. "It's precisely the thing. Mathematical repentance." He poured himself a brandy and stood at the window overlooking the fog-choked street. Somewhere below, a newsboy shouted an evening headline, and the words rose distorted. "Clergyman's killer sentenced. Curate to serve 5 years." Whimsy frowned slightly. 5 years, he said, remarkably lenient. "It appears that remorse counts for more than reason." He drank, then added with soft irony, "One might say he's been promoted to purgatory." For several days he busied himself with trivialities, visiting the British Museum to consult an obscure folio on Renaissance locks, attending a charity recital at which the soprano sang with admirable sincerity and no pitch, and correcting a friend's Latin epigraph in a newly published novel. Yet the image of the dead vicar remained, obstinate as a refrain. The key turned inward, the candle guttering, the faint scent of chloroform sanctifying deceit. It was not the murder itself that disturbed him, he had seen far worse, but the symbolism. "Why," he asked Bunter one night, "do we persist in believing that virtue resides in enclosure? Every murderer I've met has built himself a private chapel before committing the crime." "Because, my lord," said Bunter gravely, "privacy is cheaper than confession." Whimsy laughed softly. "You are becoming positively philosophical, Bunter. I shall have to send you to the Sorbonne." The winter advanced. Christmas lights appeared faintly through the fog, and the newspapers replaced moral outrage with recipes. Yet one afternoon, as Whimsy sat composing a flippant note to the editor of the Times about misquoted Virgil, a small package arrived, postmarked Winton. Inside lay a single brass key, newly polished, and a card in a precise hand. "For the one who understands locks, S.H." For a moment, Whimsy did not move. The initials were unmistakable. Mrs. Harrow, whose quiet figure he had imagined vanishing into grief, had sent him a memento, or perhaps a challenge. "She's tidying again," he murmured. "Even her guilt must be catalogued." He turned the key over in his fingers. It was not from the vestry door. This was smaller, decorative, the sort used for private drawers. "Bunter," he said thoughtfully, "how long does it take a woman to turn sorrow into ritual?" "Depends on the woman, my lord. Some manage it by tea time." "Precisely. Fetch the post directory. We're going back to Winton." They arrived 2 days later under a sky so pale it seemed leached of conviction. The vicarage was shuttered. A neighbor informed them that Mrs. Harrow had moved to a cottage on the cliffs, to be nearer the sea, as though proximity to vast emptiness could provide solace. Whimsy found her there, sitting by the window with a view of endless grey water. She looked older, or perhaps merely finished. "You received my gift," she said without turning. "Yes," said Whimsy, "a charming relic, but I fear it has a story attached." "It belonged to Simon," she said quietly, "to his desk drawer. The police never opened it. You might wish to." She handed him a small wooden box, polished thin by handling. Inside were several sheets of paper, Harrow's handwriting, unmistakable. The topmost was a confession of sorts, dated the day before his death. "If I cannot save him, I must contain him. Better to lock sin than to expose it. God will understand." Beneath it lay a note addressed simply to her. "Forgive me, Anna. The door must be closed from within." Whimsy replaced the papers gently. "So," he said, "he meant to shut himself in. Our curate merely hastened the parable." She gave a brittle smile. "You see, even the righteous destroy themselves tidily. I sent you the key because you seem to collect such things." For a moment, neither spoke. The sea pounded faintly below, steady as breathing. "You've made peace with it, then?" Whimsy asked. Peace? She shook her head. No, I've made pattern. That's not the same. Indeed not, he said softly. Pattern is the intellect's apology to grief. She turned her eyes toward him at last. And what do you do with your patterns, Lord Peter? He smiled faintly. I hang them in the Museum of Memory, madam, and pray the dust will make them honest. She laughed once, quietly. Then take the key. I'm tired of keeping doors. When he left, the fog was rising again from the water, curling around the rocks like incense. He held the little brass key in his palm, warm from her touch, and thought of the endless human effort to master locks. Physical, moral, spiritual. There's the whole tragedy of civilization in a bit of brass, he said aloud. We invent confinement and call it safety, and then die proving the point. Bunter, who had waited by the car, gave a respectful cough. Shall we be returning, my lord? Yes, Bunter. London beckons, and I believe I've had enough salvation for one lifetime. As they drove away, the church bell on the hill began to toll, slowly, deliberately, though there was no funeral that day. Whimsy smiled to himself, half in melancholy, half in amusement. Ah, St. Thaddeus, he murmured, still locking the door after the soul has fled. In the weeks that followed his second departure from St. Thaddeus, Lord Peter Whimsy found that London had regained its customary ability to amuse without distracting and to weary without warning. The city pulsed with its indifferent rhythm. Omnibuses groaned through wet streets, newspaper boys declaimed scandal as civic duty, and women in fur collars drifted through Bond Street like well-dressed ghosts. Yet beneath this urbane monotony, Whimsy felt the faint pulse of disquiet, an echo of the sea wind that had rattled the church windows above the cliffs. He had, by all rational accounts, finished with the affair. The curate condemned, the sister resigned, the priest sanctified by pity, and yet, like a melody played too softly to ignore, the matter persisted. It was not doubt, exactly. He never doubted his conclusions. But something subtler, a sense that the crime had been solved, but not understood. One evening, while Bunter polished the silver with military solemnity, Whimsy stood by the hearth and said abruptly, "Have you ever noticed, Bunter, that when a man locks a door to keep out sin, it always finds another entrance? In Harrow's case, through the curate's conscience. In others, through politics or marriage. The locks may change, but the locksmith is always the same." Bunter, rubbing a candlestick to perfection, replied, "Indeed, my lord, though I fancy sin requires less ingenuity than most artisans." "True," said Whimsy thoughtfully. "Sin improvises. Virtue rehearses." A few days later, Parker telephoned to report an odd coincidence. "You'll appreciate this," he said. "Another vicar in Hampshire. Similar business. Locked vestry, door barred from inside. Man found dead by the altar. Only this one left a note. The key is not of iron. The papers will make a feast of it." "How delightfully recursive," said Whimsy. "England, it appears, breeds both traditions and imitators. Have they ruled suicide?" "Not yet," said Parker. "But the pattern's familiar. I thought you'd be amused." "Amused, my dear Charles, is one word. Alarmed another. Keep me informed." After he hung up, Whimsy stared for a long time at the telephone, as if it had just whispered an inconvenient truth. "The key is not of iron," he repeated. "What the devil does one lock a soul with, if not iron?" That night he dreamt, not of the murder, but of doors. Endless doors, stretching through corridors of stone, each marked with Latin inscriptions he could not read. He walked among them, trying each handle, but none opened. At last he came upon a single door of wood, plain and narrow, with a keyhole that pulsed faintly, like a living thing. When he bent to look, he saw only his own eyes staring back. He woke with a start and reached automatically for his cigarette case. "Subconscious theatrics," he muttered. "Jung would have a field day." Bunter entered silently, bearing the Morning Post, Among the letters was a clipping, anonymous, folded without note, from a provincial newspaper. The headline read, "Priest's Death Mirrors Earlier Case." The article mentioned a certain Reverend Calthorpe, found dead in a locked vestry after attempting to exorcise the sins of secrecy. Whimsy's mouth tightened. "Our friend Corbett has started a fashion," he said grimly. "Faith and locks, the latest contagion." By noon he was on the train to Hampshire. Bunter followed with the composure of one resigned to the inevitability of human curiosity. The village of St. Mary Underwood was much like St. Thaddeus had been, clean, repressed, and faintly guilty. The police, surprised but not displeased by Whimsy's arrival, handed him the facts with provincial efficiency. The vicar, aged 50, had been found dead on the stone floor, candles still burning, no marks of struggle. The door locked from within, the window bolted. The doctor reported heart failure. But there was, as Parker had said, the note. "The key is not of iron." It lay on the altar now, a thin scrap of paper written in an angular, foreign hand. Whimsy bent over it, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said quietly, "I've seen this script before." He asked to see the vicar's belongings and was shown a small writing desk, neatly arranged, containing a few letters and a pamphlet on ecclesiastical architecture. Tucked beneath the lining of a drawer was a postcard. "Greetings from Louvain, AC." Whimsy held it up to the light, smiled faintly, and said, "Our Belgian Jesuit again. Either Father Corbett runs an unusually fatal correspondence, or someone is borrowing his style." He pocketed the card to the constable's mild disapproval and examined the lock on the vestry door. "Not identical," he murmured, "but similar craftsmanship, counterweight system, internal bar, designed to be closed more easily than opened. A mechanical metaphor for confession, Bunter. One shuts out the world and hopes God is less inquisitive." "It seems a dangerous devotion, my lord." "Indeed. But men have always confused secrecy with sanctity." That evening, as fog crept through the village, Whimsy called at the rectory and was received by Miss Partridge, the vicar's spinster cousin. She was dry as parchment and twice as brittle, but her eyes gleamed with the peculiar brightness of the self-righteous. "My cousin was a man of profound faith," she declared. "He believed sin should be imprisoned within the soul, not paraded in public." "A bold theology," said Whimsy. "And did he by chance study in Belgium?" "Why, yes," she said, surprised. "He spent a year at Louvain. He admired a priest there. Father Corbett, I think." Whimsy sighed. The contagion spreads. He thanked her, leaving her puzzled by his tone, and walked back to the inn under a sky that seemed stitched with faint silver threads of mist. In his room, Bunter had already arranged the evidence. A sketch of the lock, photographs of the vestry, and a transcription of the note. "Observe, Bunter," said Whimsy, tapping the words. "The key is not of iron. What then is it made of? Guilt? Pride? Doctrine?" Bunter, unperturbed, poured tea. "Faith, perhaps, my lord." "Ah, yes," said Whimsy softly. "Faith, the most dangerous metal of all." He sat for a long while in silence, staring at the papers. "Do you suppose," he said at last, "that ideas can murder as efficiently as men? A thought, once born, may find executioners wherever vanity allows." "A troubling notion, my lord." "Precisely, which is why it must be true." Before dawn he wrote a letter to Father Corbett, brief and pointed. "You have disciples, Father, who build their altars in tombs. Tell me, do you preach salvation or confinement?" He did not expect an answer. Yet 3 days later, one arrived. It was short and unsigned. "My dear Lord Peter, ideas, like locks, are innocent until turned. What men choose to imprison is their own affair. Yours, A.C." Whimsy read it twice, then laughed softly. "He's right, Bunter. The crime is never the lock. It's what we place behind it." He returned to London with a curious sense of completion, not satisfaction, but a kind of intellectual melancholy. The case in Hampshire, he knew, would fade as the other had. The papers would forget, the parish would gossip, and the world would resume its ordered hypocrisy. Yet something had shifted, a hairline crack in the veneer of his detachment. "Perhaps," he said one evening, "there are too many locked doors in the world, and not enough courage to open them." Bunter looked up from polishing the decanters. "In my experience, my lord, most people prefer to leave them shut." "And you?" asked Wimsey. "I, my lord, merely keep the keys in order." Wimsey smiled. "Then we make a fine pair, one collecting doors, the other cataloguing sins." Later, alone, he took the little brass key Mrs. Harrow had given him from his pocket. It gleamed faintly in the firelight, innocent, absurd. He turned it over, tracing the ridges with a finger. "Not of iron," he whispered. "Perhaps of memory." He set it down beside his brandy glass, where it caught the light like a fragment of conscience. Outside, the bells of St. Martin's began to ring, echoing faintly through the fog. Each note sounded to him less like a summons than a reminder, an insistence that even in a world of logic and locks, something unanswered always remains, knocking, patient as eternity, upon the other side of the door. The winter deepened, and with it came that peculiar stillness London wears when snow has not yet fallen but threatens to. The streets gleamed with damp reflection, the lamps were dim halos in the mist, and the Thames rolled beneath the bridges like a dark, forgotten thought. Lord Peter Wimsey had taken to late walks through Bloomsbury, hat brim low, gloves immaculate, mind occupied by an unease that could not be categorized. It was not guilt, he seldom felt that troublesome luxury, but the sense that something in the affair of the priests, the locks, and the Jesuit had brushed the edge of a larger mystery. Murder, as he knew, was the most explicit of moral statements. Yet this series of locked doors and fatal devotions seemed to conceal something that resisted statement altogether. The clue, if there was one, lay not in the hands of the dead, but in the motives of those who sought to seal them away. "A man kills to silence another," he said aloud to the night. "But who, in God's name, locks himself in to silence himself?" The question hung in the fog like the chime of a bell, unanswered and oddly consoling. When he returned to his flat, Bunter awaited him with a telegram. "From Louvain again, my lord," he said. Wimsey tore it open. The message was brief and unsigned. "There are no doors, only mirrors. A.C." He read it twice, then laughed softly. "Mirrors," he murmured. "That's the word I was missing. We mistake reflection for confinement, and when the image rebels, we call it sin." He tossed the telegram into the fire, watching the paper curl upon itself in silent obedience. "Bunter," he said, "I think I've had enough correspondence with the ecclesiastical imagination. It's too efficient a murderer. Shall I file the Belgian notes under curiosities, my lord?" "Better under human nature," said Wimsey. "That's the larger cabinet, and seldom full." Days passed without incident, until one morning a thin envelope arrived addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a small newspaper clipping and a single sentence written in pale ink. "You found the key, but not the door." The clipping reported that Mrs. Anna Harrow had drowned herself off the cliffs near St. Thaddeus. The coroner had called it accidental, the sea being rough, but Wimsey knew better. He read the sentence again, feeling its peculiar chill. "You found the key, but not the door." There was something at once cruel and pitying in the phrase, as if she had died still arguing with his logic. He stared out the window at the pallid light creeping across the square. "Poor woman," he said quietly. "She lived too long in other people's silences." He turned to Bunter. "Order a ticket to Winton. The sea and I have unfinished business." He arrived 2 days later under a sky as hard and colorless as pewter. The village, half asleep under the wind, received him with its usual blend of suspicion and reverence. He walked alone to the church on the hill where the bell hung mute and the ivy had grown thick over the vestry wall. The door had been mended once more. The lock gleamed new and earnest, as though determined to forget its reputation. He entered, hat in hand, and stood for a while in the cold nave. The silence there had changed since his last visit. It was deeper, more resolved, like a wound that has closed without healing. At the altar, a single candle flickered in a draught, left by some devout soul to honor a memory the rest of the parish preferred to avoid. He knelt beside it, not in prayer but in thought, and whispered, "She was right, you know. The key is useless without the door." The echo came back to him faintly, repeating his words as though the stones themselves remembered. He found the cottage where Mrs. Harrow had lived now empty, its windows shuttered against the sea. On the table lay a book of psalms, open to a passage marked in pencil. "Lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be ye lift up, ye everlasting doors." Between the pages, tucked flat and deliberate, was another of her tidy notes. "I forgive him for dying, but not for leaving the door open." Whimsy stood for a long while by the window, watching the waves strike the rocks in slow procession. "A woman who scrubs the world clean," he murmured, "will always drown in its reflections." He closed the book and placed it back exactly as she had left it. That evening, as darkness gathered, he climbed the narrow path to the cliffs. The wind tore at his coat and filled his ears with the hollow roar of the sea. He stopped near the edge, where the grass gave way to sheer stone, and looked down. The tide moved like a living creature, restless and immense, indifferent to both sin and salvation. He thought of the vicar locking himself in to expiate guilt, of the curate killing to preserve reputation, of the sister scrubbing endlessly at invisible stains, of the Jesuit who sent riddles across borders like small acts of mercy. And he thought, too, of himself, of the clever man who collected tragedies as others collected medals, arranging them neatly in the shelves of his intellect. "Perhaps," he said softly, "I too am merely a custodian of locks. Every mind its vestry, every conclusion a kind of tomb." The wind shifted, carrying the salt spray upward. He turned back toward the village, and as he walked, the church bell gave a single, uncertain sound, half a toll, half an echo. "Once is enough," he said. "Even repentance, repeated too often, becomes vanity." He returned to the inn where Bunter waited, impassive as ever, and poured himself a measure of whiskey. "You've seen the sea, my lord?" asked Bunter. "I have," said Whimsy. "It's remarkably consistent in its opinions. It absolves nothing, remembers everything, and keeps its doors perpetually open." That night, sleep came late. He dreamed again of corridors and locks, but this time there were no doors at all, only walls made of mirrors, each reflecting another version of himself. One laughing, one praying, one watching. In the center of that endless hall lay a single key, gleaming faintly, and when he stooped to pick it up, the reflections began to speak in unison. "What you open, you become." He woke with a start, the words still ringing in his ears. The candle beside the bed had burned down to a stub, its wax pooled in the shape of a small, deliberate spiral. At dawn, before leaving Winton, he visited the church once more. The fog was thick enough to muffle even his footsteps. On the vestry door hung a small sign, newly painted by some earnest parish hand. "Closed for repairs." He smiled faintly. So it always is. Before turning away, he slipped something into the lock, the brass key Mrs. Harrow had given him, and left it there, gleaming softly in the grey light. It fit perfectly, as if the door had been waiting all along. "A little courtesy between professionals," he said, one lock acknowledging another. Then he walked down the hill, the fog swallowing him as quietly as a closing door. On the train back to London, the countryside slid past like a film of half-remembered images. Hedgerows, smoke, brief flashes of water. Whimsy sat in silence, hands folded, expression thoughtful but remote. Bunter, seated opposite, finally ventured, "I take it the matter's settled, my lord." Whimsy considered. "Settled, yes, though not concluded. The world is full of locked rooms, Bunter, and not all of them contain corpses. Some hold only the living, afraid to come out." "And the keys, my lord?" "Everywhere," said Whimsy. "Hidden in guilt, forged in fear, misplaced in habit. But they all open the same thing in the end." He looked out at the snow beginning to fall across the fields. "You know, Bunter, I begin to think we are all priests of our own confinement." "A melancholy thought, my lord." "Not at all," said Whimsy, with that faint ironic smile that seemed half prayer, half apology. "It's merely logical." The train plunged into a tunnel, and for a moment everything went dark, the kind of darkness that suggests not absence but depth. When they emerged again, the snow had thickened, softening the edges of the world. Whimsy leaned back, closed his eyes, and murmured, "Locked from within." It was not confession nor epiphany, but something smaller and more final, a man acknowledging the quiet machinery of his own soul. And outside, in the vast and indifferent whiteness, the snow fell like dust upon 1,000 unseen doors. By February, the snow had melted into that grey, glistening film that makes London resemble an old photograph too often handled. The pavements hissed beneath carriage wheels, the air smelled of damp wool and gaslight, and Lord Peter Whimsy moved through it all like a man half present, a spectator at his own return. He had resumed the surface of his life, the lunches at the club, the small debates about Latin quotations, the occasional rescue of a friend from an unsuitable engagement, but something had subtly shifted, as though part of him still listened for a bell that had stopped ringing. The affair of the locked priests had receded into gossip now, relegated to the archives of curiosity, but its aftertaste lingered like incense, too sweet, too persistent, and faintly suffocating. "It is one thing," he told Bunter one morning while pacing before the fire, "to unlock other people's mysteries. Quite another to find that one's own conscience has been quietly bolting the door." Bunter, who knew the signs of intellectual weather as others know approaching rain, offered coffee in silence. Whimsy took it absently. "Do you suppose," he mused, "that men like Harrow or Denning begin with faith and end with habit? I wonder whether belief, when overpolished, loses its reflection altogether." A letter from Parker arrived that afternoon, written in his neat utilitarian hand. "You may rest easy," it began, "for the Belgian priest Corbett has apparently died of natural causes in Louvain. I thought you'd want to close the file." Whimsy smiled wryly. "The file closes itself as always. Even the devout must retire eventually." He folded the letter but did not put it away. "Natural causes," he murmured. "That phrase is a masterpiece of ambiguity." For 2 days he went about his usual round, an auction of early Tudor manuscripts, a concert at Queen's Hall, a dinner with Parker where they discussed politics and agreed it was too illogical for either's taste. Yet on the 3rd evening, as he prepared to turn in, Bunter brought in a small parcel addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. It bore a Belgian stamp, though the return address was indecipherable. Inside was a single object, a fragment of old iron, curved, corroded, unmistakably part of a lock. No note accompanied it, only a small scrap of paper with 2 Latin words written in faint, spidery ink. Clausum est. Closed. Whimsy regarded it for a long moment before saying, "So even the dead correspond." That night he dreamed again of corridors, but this time he was walking not alone but with Harrow beside him, silent, his face half-shadowed. The priest carried a candle whose flame bent away from him as though light itself refused familiarity. At the end of the corridor stood a mirror. When Whimsy looked into it, he saw no reflection, only a door swinging slowly open. He woke with the sensation that someone had been standing by his bed. The room was empty, of course, except for the faint smell of extinguished wax. "Well," he said aloud, "if ghosts insist on visiting, they could at least be punctual." In the days that followed, he found himself reading theology at breakfast, as though the intellect could disinfect the imagination. Aquinas, Augustine, Pascal, all argued earnestly about sin and grace, none about locks. "What all these gentlemen lack," he told Parker over lunch, "is mechanical imagination. They speak of salvation as though it were an abstraction. In fact, it's a device, ingeniously constructed, poorly maintained, and prone to jamming." Parker regarded him over his glass. "You're beginning to sound like a heretic." "Not at all," said Whimsy. "Only like an engineer who's seen the blueprints." Late one afternoon, as dusk crawled over the city, Whimsy took the fragment of lock from his desk and carried it to the fireplace. He turned it over in his hands. The metal was cold and rough, its broken edge sharp as a question. "Clausum est," he whispered. "It is closed." He hesitated, then set it on the mantel beside the brass key from Mrs. Harrow. The two pieces, mismatched yet strangely harmonious, seemed to mock one another. "Bunter," he said, "there's a symmetry to all this that almost persuades me of Providence. Every lock leaves behind its ghost, every key its confession." "Shall I dispose of them, my lord?" "No. Leave them, a reminder that curiosity, like sin, is never quite punished enough." As spring approached, the city brightened reluctantly. One morning, while crossing the park, Whimsy paused to watch a small boy attempting to open a gate whose latch had frozen in the cold. The boy pushed, rattled, then stepped back and simply climbed over. Whimsy smiled. "There's the solution to every metaphysical problem, Bunter. Ignore the mechanism and proceed by audacity." "Indeed, my lord," said Bunter, "though society might call it trespassing." "Society always does," replied Whimsy. That evening brought an unexpected visitor, a young clergyman, thin, nervous, and sincere, who introduced himself as Denning's successor at St. Thaddeus. "I came to thank you, Lord Peter," he said awkwardly. "The parish owes you more than you know. We've repaired the vestry, reopened the services. It's peaceful again." Whimsy regarded him with faint amusement. "Peace, my dear sir, is merely the interval between scandals. But I'm glad of your news. Tell me, do you keep the door locked?" The young man flushed. "No, my lord. I thought it best to let in the air." "Very wise," said Whimsy. "And the sea, still misbehaving?" "Endlessly." "Ah," murmured Whimsy. "Then nature, at least, retains its morals." He wished the man good night, and, after he had gone, stood for a long while at the window, watching the lamplight tremble in the mist. Weeks slipped by, indistinguishable but for the slow return of sunlight to the squares. Parker sent word of another case, routine, bloodless, and Whimsy took it out of courtesy, though it engaged neither his intellect nor his heart. The newspapers began speaking again of politics, of theatre, of petty scandals. The world, like the sea, was tidying itself. Yet one evening, as he sat alone reading, he heard a faint sound from the study, a click, soft as a breath, unmistakably the sound of a key turning in a lock. He rose at once, but the room was empty. The brass key on the mantel had shifted slightly, resting now against the broken fragment of iron. "Coincidence," he murmured, though the word sounded unconvincing even to himself. He reached out, touched the key, and found it faintly warm. Later, he told himself it had been the fire, or perhaps Bunter tidying. But that night he dreamed not of corridors or mirrors, but of a single door standing open onto darkness, and beyond it, the steady rhythm of waves against stone. He walked through it without hesitation, hearing his own voice, distant, ironic, as if carried back by the wind. locked from within. He woke before dawn, the room still and colourless, London barely breathing beyond the windows. He poured himself a glass of brandy, sipped it, and smiled faintly. "So ends the theology of locksmiths," he said. "We spend our lives opening what was meant to stay closed and calling it enlightenment." The key and the fragment still lay together on the mantel, gleaming faintly in the half-light. He looked at them once more before turning away. "Clausum est," he whispered again, not as lament, but as benediction. The words seemed to settle into the air, final yet merciful. Then, with the calm precision of habit, he drew the curtains against the dawn. Behind him, unseen, the brass key slipped gently from the mantel to the hearth below, striking the stone with a sound no louder than a heartbeat. By mid-March, London had settled into that peculiar, reluctant cheerfulness which follows the first tentative sun, the kind that makes gas lamps seem sentimental and puddles reflective of human absurdity rather than sky. Lord Peter Wimsey walked through the streets with the air of a man observing a play already familiar, yet enjoying the performance all the same. Though the case of St. Thaddeus had long since been closed in the eyes of law and parish gossip, it lingered in his mind as a curious exercise in both morality and mechanism. The brass key Mrs. Harrow had given him, along with the fragment of corroded iron, rested on his mantel like small monuments to human folly, reminders that behind every tidy solution there lurks a remainder of complication. He poured himself a glass of brandy one evening, sat in the low firelight, and reflected that death, though inevitable, often arrived not with thunder, but with the gentle, almost apologetic sound of a key turning. "Bunter," he said softly, "the world has many doors, yet very few keys, and those who hold them are rarely the ones we expect." Bunter, who polished silver with unerring precision, looked up. "Shall I catalogue them, my lord?" "No," Wimsey replied. "Let them stand unsorted. A reminder that disorder is a more faithful companion than order, even if it is less polite." The thought lingered as he opened the window and inhaled the faint, bracing scent of the Thames. Somewhere along the river, a boy was throwing stones, and the echo of splashes reminded Wimsey of the small, inexorable consequences of even the most minor actions. He thought of Denning, trembling behind locked doors, of Mrs. Harrow scrubbing floors as though she could erase the traces of sin, and of Reverend Harrow himself, whose devotion to locks and ritual had become a fatal irony. Each had acted according to principle, fear, or habit, yet all had been bound by the same invisible law. One cannot manipulate human conscience without inviting a countermeasure, often cruel and precise. The following day, a small envelope arrived, bearing no return address. Inside was a note, written in the same delicate hand as the earlier correspondence from Mrs. Harrow. "The door remains open, though the key is yours." Wimsey studied the words carefully. They were not a threat, nor a plea, nor even a confession. They were simply a reminder that some outcomes, though concluded, continue to reverberate in ways subtle and persistent. He placed the note beside the brass key, noting with satisfaction that both objects seemed to occupy the same space without colliding, as though they had reached an uneasy truce. Bunter, observing his master's deliberation, refrained from comment, understanding that Lord Peter had entered a dialogue not with people, nor with objects, but with the consequences of human curiosity. That evening, after returning from a short visit to the British Museum, Wimsey settled into his habitual reflection, considering the moral geometry of the case. Every act, he noted, had been a lock, some physical, some psychological, some moral. Each key, literal or metaphorical, had opened or closed in accordance with human intention. The curate's fear, Mrs. Harrow's meticulous order, the vicar's obsession with locks, and even Father Corbett's cryptic correspondence, All had intersected with precision, producing consequences that were simultaneously inevitable and avoidable. Wimsey, raising his glass, murmured, "It is a curious arrangement, Bunter, that mankind persists in seeking closure when it is precisely the openness that instructs the most. The locked door teaches more than the unlocked one ever could." The following week, a minor scandal occupied the newspapers. A dispute in a distant parish over a bequest, an argument over pew rent, a minor theft of communion silver. Wimsey read the accounts with mild amusement, noting the mechanical predictability of human error. He wrote brief letters, correcting Latin quotations and observing the manners of distant acquaintances, yet always, in the corner of his mind, the quiet echo of the St. Thaddeus case persisted. He understood now that no verdict, no confession, and no legal procedure could entirely close the moral loops that humans construct. The brass key, the fragment of iron, and the letters were small artifacts of that understanding, tangible reminders that logic could resolve circumstances, but rarely exercise the lesson embedded within them. One afternoon, Parker arrived unexpectedly at Bellamy's, bringing news of a minor theft at a nobleman's estate. "It seems human ingenuity is as vigorous as ever," Parker remarked, producing a small dossier. Wimsey examined it briefly, then leaned back in his chair. "Yes, Charles. The forms change, but the substance remains. Locks, keys, letters, and lies. The machinery is old, reliable, and admirably efficient." Parker regarded him with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "Do you ever tire of it, Peter?" "Occasionally, when the human heart is more compliant than it ought to be. But boredom is preferable to ignorance." That night, alone in his study, Wimsey turned the brass key between his fingers once more. The metal was warm, the edges smooth from handling, yet its purpose was now symbolic, almost ceremonial. He placed it on the mantel with the fragment of iron, imagining them as sentinels over a quiet, moral landscape. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the city breathed in its usual rhythm, indifferent and uninterrupted. Wimsey, seated comfortably, considered the sequence of events. The vicar who locked himself away, the curate who trespassed immorality, the sister who attempted to scrub sin into invisibility, the foreign priest who communicated cryptic warnings, and the townsfolk who observed with mild curiosity. Each had contributed to the unfolding, yet none had entirely controlled it. Human intention, he reflected, was a curious mechanism, capable of precision and error in equal measure. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the pale curtains, Wimsey stood by the window overlooking the street. The fog had lifted, and the city appeared crisp and exact. He sipped his brandy and noted the precision of it all. Pigeons on the pavement, hats worn at exactly the right angle, footsteps measured and faint. "It is, Bunter," he said softly. "A city of doors, some open, some closed, all demanding attention, and yet, for all their variety, each door teaches the same lesson. The consequences of our choices are inevitable, and only our recognition of them can render them bearable." Bunter, polishing a candlestick, nodded without comment, accustomed to the philosophical tendencies of his master. Later that day, Wimsey received a final letter, postmarked Winton. It was brief and simple. "You may close the case, Lord Peter, but do not presume to close the conscience. Yours, A.H." He read it twice, and then folded it carefully, placing it beside the brass key. "A final courtesy," he said aloud, "from a woman who understood the nature of her own locks. She leaves me the key, yet claims no mastery over the door. Precisely what a detective requires. Clarity without intrusion, justice without triumph." The sun set behind the city, golden light striking the fire-polished surfaces of his study, and for the first time since the affair began, Wimsey leaned back and allowed himself the faintest smile. The world outside carried on as usual. Gossip, commerce, folly, But within his study, the locks rested quietly, the keys beside them, and all was temporarily at peace. By early April, the city had settled into that peculiar clarity which follows the last hints of frost, when the streets gleam clean and sharp, and even fog seems reluctant to linger. Lord Peter Wimsey moved among the throngs with his customary composure, yet there was a quiet weight behind his eyes, a trace of the long shadows cast by his recent inquiries. Though the affair of St. Thaddeus had concluded in the eyes of the law, in the minds of the living, and in the careful columns of the local papers, it persisted in memory, folded like a delicate letter into the corners of thought. He walked past the Thames, watching the light play on the ripples, thinking of the locked doors, the keys, and the human compulsion to enclose what ought to be free. Each reflection in the water seemed to wink with irony, as though the river itself understood the foolishness of human designs. "Bunter," he murmured as they paused on the embankment, "I sometimes suspect that men invent locks only to measure their courage, and that they are invariably disappointed." Bunter, polishing the spectacles he always carried, offered no comment, understanding that remark, like many of his masters, was to be observed rather than answered. He returned to his flat to find the brass key from Mrs. Harrow and the fragment of iron still resting side by side on the mantelpiece. He picked up the key, turning it between his fingers as one might examine a delicate instrument. The warmth of the metal seemed to recall faintly the hand that had given it, the sense of intent and caution embedded within its small curves. "It is remarkable, Bunter," he said softly, "how a piece of metal can carry not only mechanical consequence but moral weight. Each notch and bevel is an argument, each turn a statement of principle." He replaced it carefully and leaned back, letting the firelight dance across the room, casting long shadows that seemed almost to articulate the faint tension of his thoughts. The case, though closed, had left him with a lingering impression that some matters, once set in motion, persist beyond law, memory, and conscience. The following morning, a courier brought a small parcel from Winton, neatly wrapped in brown paper and secured with string. Inside was a single sheet of vellum, carefully folded, and upon it a note in Mrs. Harrow's precise hand. "Observe the doors you open, Lord Peter, for the lock is merely an accessory to consequence. A. H." Wimsey read it twice, and then regarded it thoughtfully, placing it beside the brass key. The words were at once admonition and gift, a reminder that human acts, though seemingly confined to immediate circumstance, echo in ways subtle and persistent. He considered the vicar's death, the curate's panic, the sister's meticulous housekeeping, and the Jesuit's cryptic advice, and noted that each had contributed to a chain of events, both logical and inevitably tragic. Human intention, he reflected, could be as precise as a well-made lock or as misdirected as a wire threaded through an impossibly narrow keyhole. During the week, he resumed his routines with deliberate composure. Visits to the British Museum, afternoons at the club debating classical literature, and dinners with Parker in which the conversation remained safely terrestrial, concerned with politics, minor scandals, and the occasional misquotation of Latin. Yet the thought of the locked vestry persisted, like a minor refrain in an otherwise orderly symphony. He pondered the nature of secrecy, of the human compulsion to control, and of the consequences that invariably follow when one misjudges the resilience of those one seeks to contain. "A man may lock himself in for virtue," he said to Bunter one evening, "but the outside world has a remarkable capacity to intrude regardless of his intent. Providence, I fancy, delights in the irony of such arrangements." Bunter, ever meticulous, nodded without comment, polishing the silver with the solemnity of ritual. One afternoon, Parker appeared at Bellamy's with a small report of a burglary in an old townhouse. Wimsey examined it briefly, noting the precision of the crime and the care with which the perpetrator had avoided detection. "Notice, Charles," he said, "that even minor infractions display an almost architectural ingenuity. Man constructs both locks and logic with equal facility, though not always in the same order. Parker sighed. You will never tire of it, will you? Tiring, said Whimsy, is for the mediocre who accept coincidence. We, my dear Parker, operate at the level of design. That evening, he returned to his flat and placed the Winton correspondence and the brass key on the table. The fragment of iron gleamed dully beside them. He examined it, turning it over in the firelight, and mused on the elegance of the vicar's obsession, the tragic haste of the curate, and the disciplined ingenuity of Mrs. Harrow. Each had acted with clear intent, yet the convergence of actions had produced results that were at once predictable and remarkable in their moral symmetry. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl upward, the room growing warmer and more intimate with each rising spiral. It is, Bunter, he said, a cautionary lesson in human design. Precision, devotion, and fear interlaced to produce outcomes neither desired nor anticipated by the participants. Late at night, the city quiet except for the occasional rumble of a cab, Whimsy reflected on the notion of legacy. He thought of the keys, the locks, the letters, and the faint scent of chloroform that had lingered in the vestry of St. Thaddeus. These were small, tangible artifacts of human consequence, miniature monuments to the intersection of will, fear, and morality. The curious thing, he said softly, is that one can resolve the mechanics of a crime without ever resolving the conscience. We create order, Bunter, but the human heart remains irreducibly complex. He set down the brass key beside the fragment of iron and leaned back, eyes on the fire, imagining the sea wind still pressing against the church windows of St. Thaddeus, indifferent and persistent. A few days later, a brief telegram arrived from Father Corby in Louvain. The lock endures, the key travels, observe wisely. A.C. Whimsy read it twice, then smiled faintly. Observe wisely, he murmured. Ah, Bunter. A statement for all detectives and philosophers alike. The key may be in hand, but understanding requires patience, humility, and a willingness to acknowledge that the door may lead to more than a single conclusion. He placed the telegram with the letters and keys, arranging them in careful alignment on the mantel, a symbolic gesture of stewardship. Outside, the city lights twinkled faintly in the evening fog, their reflection in the wet streets suggesting infinite paths, both open and closed. He spent the remainder of the week attending to correspondence, visiting the British Museum for obscure inquiries on ecclesiastical devices, and making the occasional remark on Latin quotations with acquaintances, yet always returning, in thought, to St. Thaddeus. The locks, the keys, and the moral architecture of human behavior had left their impression, subtle but persistent. Every act, every choice, every precaution, though apparently isolated, had contributed to a pattern, an intricate lattice of intent and consequence. As he prepared for bed one night, Bunter placed the final letter in its envelope, ready for dispatch. Whimsy paused, looking at the items arrayed on the mantel. Even when the story is ostensibly concluded, Bunter, the evidence endures, not merely for study, but for reflection, a reminder that our intellect may resolve circumstance, but it can never command the lessons embedded within it. He extinguished the candle and leaned back, listening to the faint hum of the city. Beyond the window, the Thames moved silently, persistent and unobserving, carrying with it the reflections of lamplight and the echoes of human design. He thought, briefly and with characteristic detachment, that perhaps all mysteries are ultimately doors, some locked, some open, all demanding careful attention. Clausum est, he whispered, recalling the Latin phrase that had persisted through letters, notes, and memory, alike. Closed, yet never quite finished. Outside, the night deepened, and within, the fire's warmth held the room in quiet authority, as though conscience and comprehension, artifacts and reflections, had at last reached a fragile, temporary truce.